let's talk about this vaccine lawsuit. So last night on the show, we talked about what was happening up in Canada, right, where we finally got some court documents from a lawsuit around these vaccine mandates and inhibiting, and curtailing travel and so forth. And the revelations were pretty eye-opening that the Trudeau government, specifically in Canada, was telling us that they were following the science, but in fact, the documents revealed that that was not the case, and that the science was telling us quite something different, right? It didn't matter. So they were lying to us. Well, it's the same thing happening in the United States. And I offered this last night. I said, wait until we start to see some lawsuits in the United States around vaccines. And sure enough, turns out we have had a number of them, but most of them, if all of them, have been thrown out. Okay? They've been thrown out of court. Why? For medical exemption reasons. They're just thrown out. Judges just dismissing them over medical exemptions. Okay? So if it's medical exemption, if that was the reason the lawsuit was filed, thrown out. However, the first class action lawsuit over vaccine mandates was settled this week for $10 million. Now listen to this. Healthcare providers in Illinois won a class action lawsuit against North Shore University, their health system there, over vaccine mandates. Now, these were healthcare workers who were fired for refusing to comply with vaccine mandates. But they didn't do it because of a medical exemption. They did it because of religious exemptions. So stay with me. Very interesting. This is clearly the first of many of these lawsuits to come. So this case was settled out of court, which seems like a fairly obvious outcome, because how could an employer actually defend this in front of a jury, right? Like, they're going to have to pay this out, which leads me to believe we're going to see way more of these lawsuits, because they know they cannot defend this.
But you know what? This is the bad part of this is the pharmaceutical companies intentionally put language in the bill that you can't go after them for any adverse reactions to the vaccine. However, now this is all put on the people who were following the data from the government and the pharmaceutical industry to mandate this, to get these people fired, and look who's getting sued.
Right. Oh, it's not going to be Pfizer. It's not going to be Moderna. No, because of the contracts they have with the United States government, they have full immunity, right? Full immunity. And it falls then on the government to deal with any sort of fallout. And now it's falling on employers who were being told what to do, right? So these employers were trying to comply with like local, state. And so this is going to be interesting to see how far. But I'm telling you what, this is going to be a floodgate of lawsuits is coming.
But let me ask you this. Do you think that because this is happening, do you think the next time, let's say, I don't know what's going to be the next one, but let's say it's monkeypox, and all of a sudden they're wanting to mandate, do you think companies will now be, after they see all these lawsuits, a lot more reluctant to go with a mandate than they were this time around?
Yes, unless the problem is that if the government forces them to. Right. And so This is the conundrum. And so I think it's going to be on a state by state basis. It's going to be on a county by county basis. And that's where this is going to get very, very interesting based on was this, and will a judge then look at this and say, well, they had to comply with local ordinances, et cetera. And then will they be suing the state as a result? No, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on television. So the case was settled out of court. They would have to prove, now they had to prove that the vaccine mandates were either based on state or federal law, which they weren't, okay? Or they would have to prove that they were based on science, which they weren't. So they were based on public sentiment at the time. So that's what these companies would have had to have proven. Like, hey, this is a government mandate here. This is because of this issue. We were forced to make everyone get a vaccine, right? It was World War III. We had to do it. Well, it wasn't, and you didn't. So they were not going to be able to defend this in court. They were based on public sentiment.
Yeah, it basically became a virtue signal. It's like, I'm on the side of the government, even though like they couldn't get the mandate passed. So then Biden's like, well, we really strongly recommend that you still follow that guideline. So they did it. So it wasn't actually a mandate. It wasn't actually court ordered. So that's where their whole defense falls apart.
Yeah. So they were based on public sentiment and a shared belief that the vaccines were the only way out of the pandemic and the only way to protect one another. We now know that this was based on sentiment, not science, just like it was in Canada when they went through this court. And we found out that no, there was no science. You were politicking. You were politicking. Now, interestingly, this settlement includes money for employees that did get vaccinated. Hear me again. The settlement includes money for employees that went out because their bosses told them to and they got vaccinated. This should give employers nightmares, because if you have to compensate not only the employees that lost their livelihood and lost their jobs because they did not get vaccinated, that's one thing. But compensating employees who did comply is going to run up the bill. So it also places liabilities on employers for making employees do something they might not have otherwise done. So think about the Pandora's box that this opens. So think about that. Employees who then were complying, they're like, I don't want to lose my livelihood. I have to feed my family. I've got to go out and get this thing. They're telling me to. So they go out and get it. They're also getting compensated in this class action. They're getting money. The settlement against North Shore University Health System is for $10 million. People who were fired due to the mandate will get $25,000 plus and more. And those who were not fired because they did get the vaccine can still claim $3,000. They had to have tried to claim religious exemption, and then they've been denied to get that $3,000. So they had to show a religious exemption. They had to try at least to do it. Now, we even had Gerald Salenti on the show, a longtime friend of mine. I've interviewed him for many, many years over at when I was at Fox, but he has the Trends Journal and the Trends Report. He told me, he said, we started a church so that people could become a member of our church to get religious exemptions so they didn't have to take these mandates. That's how far people went. And then what's amazing to me is that these companies then could decide one way or another that, no, you are really a religious person, so you don't have to get it. Or, no, you're not really religious, so you're going to have to go get that vaccine. It's putting the onus on these employers to make that decision about who's religious or who's getting this religious exemption or not. But I love that you had to use religion instead of, hey, maybe I want to have a baby and I don't want this in my body. And so I'm going to have a baby, and my husband and I are preparing to have a baby, and I don't want to go get this. I don't want to lose my job as a medical exemption. Can I not get stuck with this? Remember that employee at, she was at ESPN, right? What was her name? I forget, Allison Williams.
I'm not a sports guy, but
Allison Williams from ESPN. She was fired for refusing to get a vaccine because she wanted to get pregnant for her second child, so ESPN fired her. But that's okay. The religious exemption, that supersedes medical exemptions, which is hilarious. So anyway, kind of back to this piece here. Plaintiffs claimed a violation of Title VII, which prohibits workplace discrimination based on, among other things, religion. These employees tried to claim religious exemption from the vaccine and were denied. And the vast majority of legal challenges to vaccine mandates, according to a Bloomberg law analysis, are religious-based. Look at this chart. In black, 39%, 39 religion, 5 for health considerations, 29 or 22 for both. So look at all of those. I mean, religious is the one that you're going to see a lot more of these. That means that most of them claim a violation of Title VII. That means that people have not sued against vaccine mandates claiming that they were denied medical exemption. This is interesting because right now this seems to be a legitimate case, in my opinion. We had data from Pfizer, of course, claiming a host of known side effects as early as December of 2020, right? We reported that here on the show.
Well, in question, was that a lawsuit that brought about the court denying them because they wanted to hide it for, I've heard 55, I've heard 75. I don't know exactly what the number was, but they wanted to hide it for a very long time. Was that a lawsuit that brought that into the Houston court where they said, no, you're not going to do that? Or was that, how did that happen?
It was that piece of information where it went from, Pfizer wanted to keep that data secret for 75 years. I think it was a ridiculous number of years. It was 50 or more. Like we'd all be dead, right? And we wanted to get that information, and then the judge said no. And I think it was through that Freedom of Information Act request, and then also because of that lawsuit, that we now have access. We were getting page dump after page dump after page dump, but the only reason we got that data was because of a lawsuit. So Pfizer tried to keep it quiet, right? Tried to hide it. Of course they did.
So I guess my overarching question then is the release of that data the only reason now they have any ground for the lawsuits moving forward? Like if we didn't have that data proving that we didn't get the right information, is that the only grounds they have, or is this just the mandate thing?
I don't know about that. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, to look at the fact that they were hiding this information, that they knew they had these adverse effects and they didn't report it, right? That, I guess that's opening up for a class action. But again, if they have these contracts with the United States government that gives them immunity, then I guess that gets thrown out. A judge just looks at it and says, "Oh, you've got immunity. So the government gave you immunity here," And by the way, those immunity clauses in those contracts, they're so broad. I mean, it covers like everything. It's like anything we've done in the past, future, or right now is covered under this. So they can basically do anything and get protection. But this, if we know from the CDC's website and the adverse effects reporting system, maybe that opens up another round of lawsuits. I don't know. But again, if they have this immunity protection, I think these guys are fine. These pharmaceutical companies, they're going to be fine. Unfortunately, but that's what happens. And they can get away with this. So most of them claimed this Title VII exemption. This is interesting, right? Because when you have that Pfizer data from December of 2020, people with the risk of blood clots or prior stroke history or vaccine allergies, they weren't listened to. They were ignored. And when they asked for these medical exemptions, what happened? Based on their health history, they were denied. And again, I come back to Allison Williams, who was fired. I mean, here's her Instagram, right? She put it up on Instagram. "I tried unsuccessfully keep this brief and get emotional. Whether you agree or disagree with me, thanks for listening. I will not echo or harbor the hostility that some may feel toward my decision, doing everything I can to move forward and stay positive." So she wanted to have a baby and said, "I don't want to get this in my body. Sorry." ESPN said, "Bye-bye." You'd think that would have a case, right? You'd have a case at the time. There was a known risk to menstruation. We covered that on the show from COVID vaccines, right?
Oh, and boy, did we catch hell for that story.
Yeah, we did.
Like we got emails, we got blasted. I mean, people were pissed that we talked about that.
But we got tons of emails from people that said, "Thank you for covering the story. I thought I was going crazy. My wife was having this issue after she got the jab, and we couldn't find any information about it." And to know then, and we were having so many people who were watching our show that said, "I had that happen to me," raising their hand. "I had that happen to me. I had that happen to me. Oh my gosh, my wife had that happen." Over and over and over again.
People personally, two people personally that's happened to.
So most of these, we knew about this, right? We knew about this at the time. And so you would think that you'd have a case given this information that was out there. But in most cases that have challenged the medical exemption, they would use the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA. Of the 5 cases that claimed this exemption, the ADA, 2 were dismissed and only 3 are actually going forward. So we'll see if those 3, we'll keep an eye on those cases. It seems that the Title VII challenge has been more successful, though, because of these religious exemptions than the medical ones, even if they're not like a slam dunk. Most of these suits, though, are filed with requests for court orders preventing employers from enforcing these mandates. And in 22 of them, the judges shut down those and allowed the employer to keep enforcing the mandate. Listen to this. Workers have filed at least 66 lawsuits against private employers since September 2021 for refusing to grant exemptions. Judges have rejected workers' requests for immediate court orders blocking enforcement of these policies in 22 of those challenges. Courts issued temporary restraining orders in just 3 of the cases, which involved employers putting workers on unpaid leave as an accommodation for not getting vaccinated. Yet those workers' victories proved fleeting, as courts later denied their bids for preliminary injunctions that would have kept their employers' policies on ice throughout the litigation. So given how hard it is to win cases like this, the Illinois case is a landmark case, the one we're talking about tonight, this $10 million settlement. We're going to see.
It sets a precedent.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to see. The thing is, though, unfortunately, because it's not then, it sets a precedent in a way. I mean, it's settled out of court. So it doesn't get the stamp that a jury has decided it, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
But it does.
Because then technically you don't have a case that you can refer to because it's not a settled case. It's not like, hey, they won this. It's out of court, therefore it's all secretive, and you can't. They won't even be able to tell the details completely of it.
Yeah, it's classified. Like we won't know. Not classified. It's not classified. What's the privileged?
Redacted.
It's redacted.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the name of our show. So, for instance, given how hard these cases to win, the Illinois case is a landmark case. We're going to see more like this coming up soon, like Tyson Foods. So right now we've got a bunch of these on the docket, so to speak. Tyson Foods is facing a massive lawsuit. Bristol Myers Squibb, Hawaiian Airlines, the Washington Nationals Baseball Club. They're just a few of the companies hit with lawsuits, according to Bloomberg Law Review of federal court dockets. So,
you know what? I wonder if, so we have a lot of people that did have adverse reactions. We've had a huge percentage of people in the polls that we've done here on the channel. I wonder if because there was the mandate and people were forced to do that, if those people, instead of suing the manufacturers of the vaccines now, will there be a way that they'll push that onto the employer now for making them get them in order to keep their jobs?
Who putting it on them? The employee?
The employer making them get it in order to keep their job. Not just the people that, got let go because they didn't and now they're using their religious exemptions, but the people who actually had an adverse reaction, kept their job, but now they couldn't do their job because they had the adverse reaction, so they end up, losing their job. Can they sue because they were basically forced to get it?
Absolutely. Right? I mean, and this is going to be, that to me is the big can of worms. That to me is the next stage of this. As Dr. Peter McCullough said, once you start having hate to say it this way, but like once you have the bodies start piling up, it's going to be very hard to hide it anymore. We're seeing this across Europe. We're seeing this in the UK. We're seeing this in Australia. We're seeing it in the United States. And there's going to be a few brave journalists who cover this story. They will be vilified for covering it. And I'm talking at a major publication, like having a New York Times, even though I can't stand the New York Times, but having finally someone covering it from 60 Minutes or the New York Times or something like that was going to have to do this story. You saw what happened with Amnesty International, right? When we covered that story.
Yeah.
Like Amnesty International finally calls attention to what's going on in Ukraine, and they have their big investigation that what we've been saying for months on this show, and they got vilified by the liberal press, So,
well, and what's really disheartening is the fact that the people responsible, the pharmaceutical industry, will not pay a dime. They will walk away. They'll probably laugh about it, like, the clause protected us. It's on these companies now. It's out of their hands. They don't care. So, therefore, there's going to be they're going to do it again if they can because it worked this time.
Well, and they'll be protected just in the way that, think about Johnson & Johnson, right? With the baby powder scandal, right? Mm-hmm. We know what it's doing to people.
Formula?
Yeah, and no, like on the skin, the talcum powder, whatever the baby powder.
I thought you meant the.
So we now know that that's causing cancer and so they had to pull it off the shelf, right? So what did Johnson & Johnson do? They took their baby powder division and they broke it off as a separate LLC, right? So now only that can be sued in that way, and they could declare bankruptcy on that LLC that's being sued, and then they can just restructure over here, and then they're fine, right? By the way, I have a real question. I'd love to know what happened to the Johnson & Johnson story. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I want to dive more deeply into that because that just disappeared. We don't hear anything about it, right? We don't hear anything about it. And it was you got one dose. You didn't have to go back for two, and whatever happened to that? And where are we with that story? I can't wait to have, we're going to learn a lot more about that in the coming months, I'm sure. But here's a couple of things we're going to be watching for. Number one, employers defending how these decisions were made. Like, will we actually go to trial where we will hear from employers like Tyson Foods or others, and who will have to admit and try to defend why they made these mandate decisions? Number two, the availability of science-based decisions at the time. What were they basing these on? Clearly, we see from the Trudeau documents in Canada that they were not listening to the science. They lied about it. And number three, availability of adverse effects at the time. Like, what was the awareness about adverse effects, and how does that play out in these lawsuits, specifically on the medical exemption piece of this? And then number four, the internal discussions, at work. Like, it'll be interesting to see through discovery, like the emails from the bosses and the HR departments when they're like on a case-by-case basis deciding whether or not somebody is religious or not. What are those emails going to reveal? What sort of objections are going to pop up during discovery? Meaning, were these people who dismiss religious exemptions as, were there people who dismissed them as legitimate? Was there a legitimate reason for them to have this religious exemption, or even the medical exemptions, and they ignored it? Again, there's plenty of people who certainly in the military. Look at all the people in the United States military that are out of a job because they've chosen not to. And then you have Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, getting COVID for the second time this week, right? He's had to lay off and fire all of these members of the military dishonorably so they don't even get pensions. And he's quadruple vaxxed. I think he's got 2 vaxes and double boosted. And he got COVID twice. And he had to lay off all these soldiers dishonorably so they don't get their pensions. So this can of worms, we're not going to stop covering this story because I think it's, as some have said, this is the greatest lie of all time that we're seeing.
And speaking of can of worms, we need to watch the legislation that comes out and see if the FDA or whoever's responsible for the new bug food, we got to make sure there's not a disclaimer on chitins or chitins or however you say it, saying, those are in there and we're not responsible, so you can't sue us later. So we need to watch that legislation heavy because that's probably going to be in there.
You will eat bugs. You will eat bugs and you will love it. You will love it. We did a whole story on bugs last night on our show. You got to go and check out that video we did on bugs and how the World Economic Forum, of course, wants you to eat bugs. You got to go check out that video. It's right here on our channel.